I'd like to introduce Roger Hallam. Roger is co-founder of the global environmental activist movement Extinction Rebellion, theorist of civil disobedience, and author of Common Sense for the 21st Century. Only non-violent rebellion can now stop climate breakdown and social catastrophe. Roger, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, well, I've done quite a few of these presentations, as you can probably imagine, and one of the things I notice is when people are talking about the climate crisis, and let's call it a climate crisis to start off with rather than climate change, okay? There's just an avoiding of actually getting down to what the actual figures and the killer facts are. You know, we're just endlessly told that there's this problem and it's quite amorphous and way off and what have you. But the fact of the matter is, over the last 10, 20 years, we pretty much know what's going to happen. And what's going to happen is mass starvation and social collapse. And that's already locked in. I just want to say that again, because I think it's important to sort of grasp what we're talking about here. We're talking about mass starvation and social collapse in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. No one quite knows, but we know it's coming. And the reason we know it's coming is because it's physics, right? This isn't a matter of ideology. It's not a matter of personal opinion. It's a matter of physical laws. I think people may have noticed that in the press in the last few days, there's been a report coming out that has the new sensitivity analysis on the climate. When we get to 560 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, then we're going to be locked in and experiencing 5 degrees centigrade global temperature increase. We thought for about 3 or 4 decades it was going to be 3 degrees, which is a total catastrophe. 5 degrees is in the territory of human extinction. In case you're not aware, 5 degrees centigrade is actually 10 to 15 degrees centigrade above today's temperatures inland, which means on a hot day, it's something like 20 to 25 degrees hotter than it is today, which means you can't grow food because you can't grow food over 30 degrees centigrade. What that means is mass starvation. What that means is a large part of the globe is going to become uninhabitable, not for a year or two, not for a decade, not for a century, but for tens of thousands of years, potentially forever. That's what we're facing. That's where we're going to. And it's the physics, right? It's not really open to debate anymore. I can give you a few other stats just to support it. At 4 degrees centigrade, the tropics are going to be uninhabitable for 6 months of the year, according to a recent paper. At 35 degrees centigrade and high humidity, the wet bulb effect is locked in. If people aren't aware of what the wet bulb effect is, maybe you should understand what it is, because it means death in 6 hours. It means the body can't cool down. At 2 degrees centigrade, the estimate from a recent paper is 1 billion people will be subject to this sort of extreme heat. Subject to this sort of extreme heat basically means they're going to die or they're going to be on the move. And that increases by 1 billion people every degree centigrade. So that's 3 billion people at 3 degrees, 2 billion people at 3 degrees, and so on, up to 5 degrees. So where's all this nonsense about 1.5, we're going to keep below 1.5? Where's all this nonsense about 2 degrees, you know, we can stay below 2 degrees? Everyone knows in the scientific community there's a carbon lag, and there's a figure on it. You can look it up. It's around 0.6. So we're 1.1 at the moment, plus 0.6, I make that 1.7. So why is the whole scientific establishment winding away about 1.5 degrees? It's a mass delusion situation. And we can add on all the other things which individually would be a mass catastrophe on their own. We've cut down 17% of the Amazon at 20 to 25%. It goes into a feedback system, which means it dies back and it's gone. That means we're contributing carbon to the atmosphere because we haven't got the trees. We can throw in methane, we can look at forest fires, we can look at water vapor, We can look at a whole load of feedback mechanisms that have already been locked in, which means even if we stopped putting carbon into the atmosphere tomorrow, we're already heading for a mass catastrophe. The other thing that people don't really talk about is what precisely does this mean for the average person, for the average British person, for the average student at Cambridge? Well, let's start off with what it means most, especially at the moment. It means economic collapse. What does economic collapse mean? It means that you're losing your jobs, you're losing your income, your house drops in value, you haven't got an education, the NHS collapses. If you thought that was completely ridiculous, think about what's happened for the last 3 months. What happens next is hunger. Hunger is a driver of social collapse. If you don't understand that, then look at some history. When people get hungry, they start killing each other. It's very rapid and it's not pretty. What happens after that is war, rape, starvation, death. Have a look at what happened in the Second World War. Let's have a look at what happened in the Congo. This is what happens when societies collapse. And in case you don't quite get it, this leads to human extinction. Human extinction through mass heat, through loss of habitat, through starvation, and through a reduction in oxygen. And you can look that last one up because I haven't got enough time to explain it. So what does this mean practically? What does it mean in terms of morality? One of the things that all these discussions do is they tend to imply we've got some sort of natural crisis here. We haven't got a natural crisis here. We've got a situation of catastrophic, unbelievable criminality. We know that these effects are being created by policies put in place by people with names and addresses. They're the top politicians and they're the people running the companies. These people are engaged in the mass murder of the human race. That's the situation. So how does this relate to COVID? Well, COVID is just a small little prelude, isn't it? A little example. We know it was in the papers last week that the British establishment is so embarrassingly stupid that it can't understand the exponential function. If it shut down the British economy a week earlier than it did, it would have saved 20 to 30,000 lives. That's not very impressive for Cambridge and Oxford, is it? Because these people educated these people who can't even understand something as basic as looking what happened in China and looking what happened in Italy. It wasn't like we didn't know. And now we've got 20 to 30,000 grieving families and a massive amount of unnecessary suffering. This tells us two things. The elites are unbelievably stupid and they're unbelievably uncaring. That's the situation. What does this mean practically? What does it mean like this week? I'm talking to mothers this week who are in tears because they know their children are going to die. I'm talking to young people this week who don't see any point doing an education, don't see any point in the future because they know they're going to be starving to death. What does it mean for Cambridge students joining the elites? It means in 10 or 20 years' time, they're going to be administrating the response to mass starvation. We're entering endless war. That's what the new generation is looking at, and that's what Cambridge students are looking at. So what's the solution? You'll notice from the other three speakers and from the establishment generally, there's no talk about the obvious solution. It's a historically illiterate perspective because everyone knows what the solution is. The solution is rebellion. To take down the governments and replace them with people's assemblies who will actually get on with the job. We've had 20, 30 years of catastrophic failure, and now it's time to act. Mass civil disobedience works, mass protest works. We've just seen that with Black Lives Matter. What we need is thousands of people on the street. And I invite the Cambridge students and anyone listening to this to get in touch with Extinction Rebellion The rebellion is going to be back on the go later in August, in September. This isn't just like an additional idea. You know, this is it. This is now. This is the reality we face. And what I'd like to suggest is it's quite slightly obscene to continue to analyse the situation. What we need to do is to talk about what we are going to do, what Cambridge University is going to do, what's it going to do with, what is it, £377 million of fossil fuel investments? Why is it still investing? That's the key question for Cambridge University at the moment. Does it want to engage in continually catastrophically criminal activity? So what I'd like to ask the other three panelists is, what's the plan? Seriously, guys, what's the plan? You know, let's talk about how we're going to respond. Let's interrogate 30 years of establishment failure. That's where I'd like to contribute.